Hey guys, what's up? My name is Zach, and today we're going to be doing a 2020 election prediction between Eric Garcetti and Donald Trump. So for those of you who don't know, Eric Garcetti is the current mayor of Los Angeles, California. He's also Mexican-American and Jewish, and today we're going to be seeing how he would do in a presidential election against Donald Trump. So overall, I think that Eric Garcetti would be not the best candidate for the Democrats to run. This is primarily because he's a mayor. He doesn't really have too much name recognition throughout the United States, and not a tremendous amount of experience either, which the Republican Party can absolutely use to their advantage. But one thing that would definitely be a benefit for him is his minority appeal. Like I said before, he is Mexican-American and Jewish, so he would have a wide array of minorities turning out for him. And he's also actively expressed interest in running for president, so that's something that's worth mentioning. And New Mexico, I'm going to list solidly in Garcetti's column, and this is because in any other scenario, this state would be likely Democrat, or for most other scenarios. But Eric Garcetti is Mexican-American, and he will have very strong appeal to Hispanics in this state. So for that reason, I would list New Mexico solidly in Garcetti's column. I would also list Georgia solidly in Trump's column, and this is mostly because Eric Garcetti is a Californian Democrat, and those types of Democrats do not have tremendous appeal in the South. If you want any chance in Georgia, especially, as I've said repeatedly, you need to nominate someone who can have strong African-American appeal, and Garcetti absolutely doesn't have that, and he won't be able to turn out those moderate Republicans, because I really don't see moderate Republicans turning out strongly for a Californian Democrat. So for those reasons, I would list Georgia solidly in Trump's column. Now let's switch color palettes. Alright, so Virginia I would list as likely in Garcetti's column. We've seen Trump's approval go up in the state. It's now at minus 5 net approval for Trump. But still, there's a solid Democratic base in the state, which Garcetti, being a Californian Democrat, could absolutely turn out to his advantage. However, there is a number of moderate Republicans in the state which would absolutely go against him, and he would lose much of the suburban areas in Virginia. However, that's not really enough to call the state anything but likely Democratic, so I would still list it likely in Garcetti's column. Going over to Colorado, I would list this likely in Garcetti's column as well, and I think that there would be a bit of a struggle for Garcetti, mostly because of lack of name recognition and lack of experience, and his lack of Midwestern appeal in general would be an obstacle for him to overcome. But still, there's a solid Democratic base in this state, and there's a solid number of Hispanics in Colorado as well, which Garcetti can also turn out to his side. So for those reasons, I would list this likely in Garcetti's column. Going down to Texas, I would list this likely in Trump's column. The only reason I'm not listing it solid is because Hispanic turnout is also a factor. If it wasn't for Garcetti's Hispanic appeal, this state would absolutely be solid in Trump's column. However, that Hispanic appeal does change things in the state of Texas, and for that reason, I would list it likely in Trump's column. However, I really don't see a Californian Democrat having any chance in states that are still pretty much in the Republicans' column, like Texas and like Georgia. Going over to North Carolina, I would list this state likely in Trump's column. I think that Garcetti could appeal strongly to the not the moderate Republicans, but the moderate Democratic base in the state, and it's worth noting that Trump's approval is low in the state, lower than states like Georgia or Texas or other typically Republican states. But Garcetti would not be able to turn out moderate Republicans to his side. He would not be able to have strong turnout amongst African Americans, and for that reason, I would list it likely in Trump's column. Going up to Maine's 2nd District, I would list this likely in Donald Trump's column. I think that Garcetti would have a very difficult time campaigning in the Northeast overall, mainly because, like I said before, California Democrats can easily be painted as elitists, or as Nancy Pelosi's, so to speak, and that would absolutely turn off a number of Democrats up here and absolutely peak Republican turnout and energize Republican turnout as well. And that 2nd District, which is already pretty much in Trump's column, and most other predictions would move from leaning to likely in Trump's column. Going over to Minnesota, I think this is going to be close, and it's going to be difficult for Garcetti, but I think it would go likely in his column. Overall, we've seen this state trend more and more Democratic since the 2016 election, and in the 2016 election, this state also went Democratic, so if it's trending more Democratic since then it's most likely going to go to the Democrats again in 2020, no matter who the candidate is. The reason why I'm not listing as leaning is because I think that Garcetti would have a pretty easy time appealing to the strong Democratic base in the state, and honestly, if you're a Democrat, you really just need that base. You don't really need to have too much crossover appeal to moderate Republicans or independents, and I think that Garcetti would absolutely secure that Democratic base in the state, making it go likely in his column. Maine's 2 electoral votes, I would list narrowly likely in Garcetti's column. I'm kind of hesitant on that, but I think that Garcetti would probably win Maine at large. We've seen Donald Trump's approval go very much down in this state overall. Again, I think that'll be close. I think that the state at large will be close in margin, but I think that in the end it'll go to Garcetti's column just because I think that he will be able to appeal to the Democratic base in Maine. Now going up to Iowa, I would list this likely in Trump's column. I think that Garcetti would have a very, very difficult time at appealing to Midwestern voters and the rural vote as well, and that's the only way, well, not the only way, but that's the chief way in order for Democrats to win in Iowa. And Garcetti, being a Californian Democrat, would have a very, very difficult time campaigning in Iowa, which has very strong resentment towards Californian Democrats and Nancy Pelosi Democrats in general. I'm not saying Garcetti is a Nancy Pelosi Democrat. However, they can absolutely draw ties between him and Nancy Pelosi just because of California in general, which Republicans tend to do when campaigning against California Democrats. So, for that reason, I would list Iowa likely in Trump's column. Now moving over to leans, I would list New Hampshire leaning in Garcetti's column. I think that, in general, this state is very unlikely to drift out of the Democrats' column. However, you nominate someone like Garcetti, who is not very, very well known, and who is from California, and who is maybe seen as a California elitist. Again, I'm not saying that if anyone from California is nominated, they would have a difficult time campaigning in the Northeast. Like Kamala Harris, for example, would most likely have New Hampshire likely in her column. However, Garcetti is specifically from Los Angeles, and he can be painted as an elitist or a Democratic elitist, which especially turns off Democrats and turns off moderate Republicans especially. And if Trump can secure his base and the moderate Republicans, this state would become competitive, but I still think Garcetti would take it just as a result of the strong Democratic base in this state in general. Going over to Nevada, I would list this state leaning in Garcetti's column. Regionalism doesn't really apply here too much unless you're a Democrat from the more eastern parts of California, not the metropolitan parts of California. However, Garcetti is the mayor of Los Angeles, the most metropolitan part of California, and that would very much turn off the moderate Republicans in this state, and maybe some moderate Democrats as well. However, we have seen this state become more Democratic since 2016. Again, Trump's approval has gone up. Recently, it's at -4, so that's also a factor when calling this state. And for all those reasons, I would list this state leaning in Garcetti's column. Going on to Arizona, I would list this leaning in Trump's column. The only reason it's not likely in Trump's column is because Hispanic factors a turnout. If it wasn't for Hispanic turnout, which Garcetti would definitely have to some degree, then this state would go likely in Trump's column. However, Garcetti will have Hispanic turnout, and Trump's low approval is a factor in the state as well. However, Garcetti is not very well known. He does lack experience, and he could be painted as a California elitist, which I've cited multiple times, and that would make this state go leaning in Donald Trump's column. Going over to Michigan, I would list this leaning in Garcetti's column. Trump's approval has remained consistently low throughout his entire time in office, and I think that Garcetti would have a difficult time campaigning in the state as a result, again, of his California origin, and more specifically his Los Angeles origin. But we've seen the state trend more Democratic overall. Trump won it very narrowly in 2016, and it's unlikely to go to him again in 2020 overall. However, I think that if Garcetti were the nominee, this would be excuse me. Sorry. This state would be very competitive overall, which is not a good thing for Democrats. If you're nominating a candidate for 2020, which has Michigan competitive and not likely in your column as a Democrat, then they're definitely doing something wrong. And overall, as you can already see by this electoral map, Garcetti would not be a good Democratic nominee for president in general. But I'll cover that more once I finish the prediction. However, Michigan has seen a very low approval of Trump. And if Garcetti were the nominee, I think that his minority turnout would also be a factor, making the state go leaning in Garcetti's column. Going down to Ohio, I would call this state leaning in Trump's column. We have seen his approval go down in this state, more so than it has been in the past few months. However, Garcetti would not be able to have very strong appeal amongst moderate Republicans. I think that he will have strong turnout in the more urban areas, like Akron, Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, but that would not be enough to win the state at large, making it go leaning in Trump's column. The only reason that's not likely is because Trump's approval is low in the state, and I think that minority turnout is kind of a factor in Ohio, but not very strong. There's not a very strong minority base in Ohio overall, which is part of the reason why it's typically listed in Trump's column. Now going over to Pennsylvania, I would list this state very narrowly leaning in Garcetti's column. Again, Garcetti would have a very, very difficult time in campaigning in the state, but I think that in the end, Pennsylvania is really seen as a more democratic Ohio, I think, in more ways than one, and I think that Garcetti would have a very difficult time campaigning in the rural areas. I think that he would have virtually no strong turnout on his side in the rural areas, and in the suburban areas, I think that he would have virtually very little turnout in the suburban areas, and I think that'll become very, very close, but Trump won this state in 2016 by a very slim margin. I believe it was under 1%, and he did that by winning virtually in the entire state except the urban areas. However, we're seeing now that Trump has a low approval in Pennsylvania, and I think in the end it'll come down to very small numbers and a very small margin, which will make it go to Garcetti very narrowly. Going over to Wisconsin, I would call this state leaning in Trump's column. Overall, as you can see already, Garcetti would have a very difficult time campaigning in the Rust Belt, and this is mostly because California Democrats, and specifically the urban California Democrats, which are seen as Democratic elitists, do not have strong appeal in the Rust Belt by any stretch of the imagination, and that's really why you're seeing this shading overall, which really should be stronger for the Democrats if they want to win in 2020. But Wisconsin has the highest amount of registered Republicans across the Rust Belt, and Garcetti would absolutely turn off those moderate Republicans. He would have very little moderate Republican turnout, virtually none, and those would go to Trump along with Trump's base in the state. And the only reason why it'd be leaning in his column and not likely is because of his low approval, and Garcetti would also have minority turnout, but that's not enough to win the state at large, making it go leaning in his column. I meant to call Nebraska second much earlier, my apologies. That would be likely in Trump's column, virtually just because it's dominated by moderate Republicans, and Garcetti would not have a very good time at appealing to those moderate Republicans, making it go likely in Trump's column. I meant to call that much earlier, my apologies. Now going over to the very last state is Florida, and this determines the election overall. And it's going to go, well, actually, I'm going to discuss it first before I call it. So Garcetti would have Hispanic turnout, not as strong as someone like Julian Castro or someone more well-known, but he would have some degree of Hispanic turnout. And Trump's approval has declined in this state, so that's something you have to take into consideration as well. However, it has remained, for the most part, pretty solid, and I can't just use just 1 month's approval ratings to call this state overall. So for all those reasons, I would call this state leaning in Trump's column, making him the victor with exactly 270 electoral votes. I think this is the first prediction where I've had either candidate win with exactly 270 votes. But in the case for Florida, I think that Garcetti and Trump would campaign very heavily in this state, and I think that it'll come down to very, very slim margins. But in the end, I think that Trump's approval is strong in the state, and Florida is dominated by many moderate Republicans, which would not go to Garcetti and which would go to Trump instead. And I think that Garcetti's Hispanic turnout would be the main driving force, which would make him very competitive in this state. But I don't think it's going to be enough to flip the state into Garcetti's column. All right, so there's the electoral map. As you can see, it is paper thin in Trump's column. Garcetti could very easily win in this prediction, specifically by winning Florida. He could also win Wisconsin. Ohio's a bit of a stretch. Arizona's a bit of a stretch. Florida is really his main path to victory, and which is very, very possible. However, it's also very possible that Trump could win Pennsylvania. It's very possible that he can win Michigan, maybe New Hampshire, maybe Nevada. Those two are unlikely. However, Pennsylvania and Michigan are a bit of a toss-up. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Oh, and before I close it, I'm going to start doing a new thing at the end of my 2020 predictions. I'm going to call it, for either candidate, the percentage of a chance they have at winning. So, for example, Garcetti's percent chance of winning in this prediction will be 45%, and Trump's percent chance of winning would be like 55%, which shows the fact that Garcetti is lost by a very narrow margin, as you can see here, and he could very easily win in this scenario if things turn out a bit differently. But this is what I'm calling it, and that's mainly because of Florida. So if you guys enjoyed the video, if you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe. It's the only way for small channels like mine to continue to grow. And if you guys want to see any specific videos in the future, leave a comment down below, and I'll put it on my list to make a video of it in the future. And yeah, I hope you guys have a good day. See ya.